In this lesson and the next few lessons, we're going to look at some of the additional shooting modes and exposure modes you have on this dial. And this is going to be very similar on pretty much any Canon DSLR. This Canon DSLR has the main one we saw earlier, which is the green automatic mode. Everything is going to be completely automatic. We also saw the mode without the flash, so completely auto, but it's not going to pop up the flash. And then we also have these other ones, M, AV, TV, and P. We already saw the manual mode in the previous lessons on the exposure triangle. If you skip those lessons, that's okay. But basically in the manual mode, you have complete control of all of your settings. The next mode I want to talk about is the AV mode, which is aperture priority mode. We have aperture priority and shutter priority, which is TV. So what aperture priority means is that it's going to manually adjust the other settings, so shutter speed and ISO, but you have control over the aperture. So now you can see on the back of the screen that the aperture option has those little orange marks on the left and right. That signifies that that's what the dial will control. Now, right now I'm actually in ISO 100, so I'm not in the manual mode. So ISO is still going to be manually selected unless you're on auto. But basically now, no matter what I choose for my aperture, it's going to try to take a well-exposed picture with those settings. So if we review this photo, pressing the review button, let's press the info button, we can see what our settings that were used. F11, that's what I chose. And then it manually set the ISO to 1000 and the shutter speed to 1/40th. So let's try again. Let's change our aperture to f22, and now we can kind of see a preview of what the shutter speed is. Take that. Now to get a well-exposed image, it changed the shutter speed to 1/40th and the ISO to 3200. Now you might say, okay, 3200 is too high based off of our knowledge of ISO. We talked about earlier that we don't want to go higher on this camera than 800. So let's go ahead and manually adjust our ISO setting to 800. And now let's go ahead and again take the photo. And the shutter speed is I think I saw that, 1/8 of a second. So that's really, really slow, right? So that might be too slow for a lot of different situations. If I'm doing still life or product photography, that might be great. Doing some night photography, architecture, that might be fine on a tripod. But if I'm taking a photo of a bicycle racing through the streets, that's gonna be too slow. So that's one of those examples of how we put together our exposure triangle, and sometimes you have to adjust these settings creatively to get the right shot. So, but really, what is aperture priority mode and why would we use it? Well, aperture priority means we are choosing our aperture based off of a creative decision. So we aren't adjusting the aperture necessarily for exposure, because no matter what we set the aperture to, the other settings are going to affect our exposure. We're really using this mode to adjust the depth of field of our photo. Now, if you skipped the earlier lesson about the exposure triangle, I would go back to that one where we covered how aperture affects your depth of field. But basically, you're making the decision, do I want a blurrier background or a sharper background? More depth of field or less depth of field? Say I want that really blurry background, I'm shooting a portrait, I'm gonna crank this down to f2.8. And now I can take my photo and all the rest of the things are going to be perfectly set. And this is great because now I don't have to think about manually setting my shutter speed or even my ISO. If I don't care what my ISO is, I just want it to be completely automatic. So if you're shooting an event, a wedding, or really in any situation where you just want to be able to quickly adjust for the creative choice of how my depth of field looks, then aperture priority is a great option. In the next lesson, we're going to go over shutter priority. So the next mode is shutter priority right here, TV. So shutter priority, very similar to aperture priority, will automatically set the other settings based off of what your shutter is. So here we can see on our back screen that the shutter is the one that we're adjusting with our dial, just like how we saw before in the manual setting, where the default is that this dial controls our shutter speed. But the difference is that depending on what we set this, the aperture is going to change. So with my shutter speed at f/180th, it used a f7.1. If my shutter speed is 1/320th, the aperture is gonna be f3.5. Say for some reason I want a really slow shutter speed, 1/13th, it's going to adjust my aperture to f20. Now again, this is with my ISO set to 800 manually. You might just have your ISO on auto mode, which is completely fine if you aren't worried about the digital noise and grain you get with a higher ISO. So when would you use shutter priority mode? This is a great option if you're shooting action, sports, things like that, where you want to be able to control how fast your shutter is, and you don't want that to be automatically slowing down, where the object that you're shooting, that's you're capturing, is going to be blurry if your shutter is too slow. If you need your shutter speed to be as fast as possible, 1/2000th of a second, put it on shutter priority mode. Your aperture can adjust, your ISO can adjust, but you need that shutter speed to be fast. So lock that in and the rest will be automated. Personally, I think it's completely fine to use these automatic modes to help you take better photos and to make it easier when you're out shooting, so you don't have to worry about all of the other settings. A lot of professionals use automatic modes like these ones. They like having the semi-manual options to control your photos creatively with depth of field and aperture, or how sharply you're capturing a moving object with shutter speed, or if you do want that motion blur or you are shooting a longer exposure. But use these two modes, aperture and shutter priority, to your advantage. In this video, we'll go over the next mode, which is the P, or program mode. So program mode isn't one I use that often or necessarily recommend that much. It's very similar to the automatic mode in the sense that it's going to automatically adjust your shutter speed, your ISO, and your aperture, depending on what you're taking a photo of. The main difference though, and we see here, we're on the back of the screen, we're in P mode, is that you can adjust your ISO to a specific one. So in automatic mode, the A+ green mode, everything is automatic. No matter what, you can't change, manually set specific settings. With P modes, there's a little bit of wiggle room. So if you go into P mode for the first time, it's going to have all these settings just automatic. And it's going to try to make sure that your ISO is as low as possible, but maybe you're in a situation without a lot of light, and it's going to make your ISO really high, meaning your photos are going to get some grain. If we want to prevent that from happening, we can go in here, press the Q button, go up to ISO, or we can actually just press the ISO button at the top, right there, and set this manually to, say, let's go 200, which gives us a little bit of room. And now we can take a photo wherever we're at. It's going to keep that ISO at 200 and then adjust the shutter speed and the aperture accordingly to expose properly. The other thing that program mode has that is actually something that you might use in some other settings is exposure compensation. So this is a fancy term to actually just allow you to make your photos a little bit brighter or darker depending on your preference. So if we're here and we see the back of our screen and we press the Q button and we go down to the exposure meter, notice that we have the dot in the middle. If we put this up a little bit, let's say up to 2, what's gonna happen is our photos are going to end up being brighter. Now, if we go back and we set that exposure compensation down, so now I'm in the actual exposure compensation menu rather than just like the preview of the menu. So pressing set, we go into that menu, or you can use the dial up here. Now if we take a photo, it's darker. So why would you use this? Why would you want your photos darker or brighter? Well, exactly that. Maybe you want your photo to be brighter or darker. Or maybe your composition that you're shooting is a little bit more complicated. Maybe you're shooting a silhouette of someone, or maybe you're shooting a dark scene with a little bit of light. And if your camera's automatically trying to adjust exposure, it might not do so properly to your creative liking. So maybe you just like most of your photos a little bit brighter. Some photographers, especially portrait photographers, engagement photographers, wedding photographers, want everything to be a little bit brighter. That's when you would boost the exposure compensation, and that's one of the settings you can change in program mode. You can also adjust the exposure compensation in some of the other automatic modes, not the completely green auto mode, but in the aperture priority and the shutter priority modes. I'm in aperture priority right now, AV. We can see that if we go into our Q options and then use the dial over there, we can still adjust the exposure compensation. When we're in the aperture priority mode, if we press the AV button, or also it has this plus or minus, which signifies the exposure compensation, and then adjust the dial up here, that will adjust the exposure compensation a little bit easier than pressing Q and using the plus pad to go into that. So if your camera looks different, look for the little icon that says plus, has a little plus or minus. That's what exposure compensation is. Sometimes even on other cameras, there's just little dials on the top where you can just manually quickly adjust the exposure compensation that way. And just similarly as in the aperture priority mode, we can do the same in the shutter priority mode. Note though, if you go to the manual mode, that's not going to be an option, because in manual mode, you're adjusting all of your settings manually. So it's up to you to use your manual settings, all of them combined, to adjust your photo a little bit brighter or darker. But just as a quick recap or refresher, if you're in the aperture priority mode, shutter priority mode, or the program mode, your camera's gonna try to get perfect exposure according to its exposure meter. It's gonna try to get that dot right in the middle, but if you want it to be a little brighter or darker, that's where you use exposure compensation. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next lesson.